So thank you all for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new ones as well. Today, as I said, Professor Michael McLendon is with us. He is the Annette and Harold Simmons Endowed Centennial Chair in Education Policy and Leadership in the Simmons School of Education here at SMU, where he also serves as Associate Dean. I won't read you his whole bio because he would never get to speak. No. We have included a bio for everybody to take a glance at. With that, I will turn the floor over to you. We will do the normal thing, speak for half an hour, 40 minutes.
Sure, that's just fine.
And then we'll open it up to Q&A. Thank you very much. Mike.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh, so much. I'm so delighted to be here with you today, and I'm glad to see some friendly faces as well. I have a couple of students who are here today, and I'm touched to be here because I've been at SMU just 2.5 years, and about a year ago, several individuals approached me and said, "Would you be willing to come to Louisa was one? Would you be willing to come over to the Tower Center and to talk with a couple of us about possibly talking about our respective futures together?" I didn't know what that meant, and so I came and I learned early on how the Tower Center does work.
That proposal could have gone a lot of different ways.
Well, it went in one particular way. I learned a lot about how you all operate. For example, I came in and Jim was there, and Louisa, Diana, and the question was, Michael, would you do policy-related work? I said, yes, I do. They said, well, we do policy and politics. Most of it around national security studies, international matters, not quite as much around domestic, with the exception of immigration issues. Would you be willing possibly to affiliate with us in some way? And I said, well, of course, I'd be honored to do that. And then they said, well, that's good. And would you then, just immediately following, would you be willing perhaps to serve as a fellow at the institute, at the center? And I said, well, of course, I'd be delighted to do that. What an honor that would be. And they said, well, that's wonderful. Now that you're willing to be a fellow at the center, we have that taken care of, would you be willing possibly to teach a course for us? And I said, well, of course, I would be delighted to teach a course for you. And then they said, well, it just so happens we just have one in mind. Former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings has agreed to teach a course for us in a new undergraduate minor program in public policy studies. How about a course, Michael, along the lines of education or higher education policy in the U.S.? And so at that, how could I say no? So you all are very wily. And it's more than a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. So thank you, Josh, and other members of the board in having invited me to affiliate. This Tower Center has become an intellectual home for me this year. And so I appreciate very much this opportunity to speak with you here today. I'm also pleased to be able to talk with you today because back up if you would just a second, because we're going to do a lot of mind reading over the next 30 minutes, 27 minutes. Okay. Because it is, in fact, the case that there is dramatic change, historic change underway in the relationship between American state governments and public colleges and universities in this country. And I've titled this Privatizing Public Higher Education in the U.S., the Political Economy of State Postsecondary Policy Change, which does, in fact, capture a lot of the work that I've been doing for about 14, 15 years. One major aspect, one line of my research has been looking at the factors that appear to shape state policy choices in the realm of higher education. We'll talk about some of the dramatic policy moments that are underway today across the 50 American states with respect to higher and post-secondary education. I could have alternatively phrased it something like politics, public policy, and post-secondary education, an emerging field that emerges once again for good, because in fact we have been talking about the importance of politics in shaping policy outcomes in the 50 American states for higher education for a long time. And we've been bemoaning the fact for an equally long period of time that no such literature has emerged. Herman James here in 1938 writing that a survey of the literature on public higher education produces very little material that has the relationship between higher ed and the state political situation as its major focus. Since the 1930s we've been saying we ought to study systematically the relationship between political institutions, actors, forces, processes, and higher education as a institution. We've been doing this for 70, 80 years, and really we haven't had until very recently a significant empirical literature emerge. Another way of thinking about this, go back one if you would, Goldman Sullivan, 1968, writing again essentially about this same observation, that there just isn't much strong literature, much systematic approach to the study of higher education. And then there was this hack in 2003 who observed that Again, because he's not very original, research on state politics of higher education, quote, is scant, fragmented, limited in substantive scope, only loosely tethered to disciplinary insights of political science or of other social science fields. The primary challenge confronting researchers, therefore, is one of stimulating a systematic and a sustained scholarship that's topically, conceptually, and methodologically multidimensional. Now, what's remarkable is that, in fact, that literature has emerged within the last 10 to 15 years. We have probably 3 to 4 dozen individuals in this country. It's not a large group of people, of scholars, but the study of higher education as a formal field, as an organized field of inquiry, as a social scientific field of inquiry, is quite small to begin with. There are only a couple of hundred of us in the country who study higher education primarily. So there's probably about 35 to 40 scholars nationally coming from the disciplines, in fact, from economics, from political science, from within, I guess we call them educationists, from trained within schools of education, who are focusing primarily on the relationship between state politics and higher education policy development and policy outcomes. Why this recent interest in understanding the drivers of state policy change? Well, one is this renewed emphasis in political science on the American state as the unit of analysis. Our own Cal Gilson and a number of other people over time have made this observation of the return of the states. Of course, political science having moved so much to the study of Congress and to studying politics at the national level, the study of state politics had long been a kind of backwater in the field of political science to some extent. And it's reemerged, in part because of methodological advances, in part because of new data sets, in part because of the devolution revolution in the American states in the 1980s and 90s, which saw significant policy activity return from Washington to the state level. And this has had implications elevating higher education as something worth studying as well. There's the decline of economic determinism as a sole explanation for policy change in the American states. For a long time, and I feel silly saying this, sharing this with my political science and other colleagues and friends trained in other disciplines, like disciplines. But in the field of higher education studies, Matthew and you and I talked about this, I think, over a beer one, and I'm saying too much about your social life, but we're going to talk about this. I think they know. Talked about this a lot over a beer one evening about the fact that in the study of higher education, there's long been this bias, a deep bias, that higher education somehow was above, it's a public good, so it's above the political fray. So why study? There is no politics to higher education. Yes, there's idiosyncratic politics, right? There's the conversation between the state legislator and his neighbor over the back fence. There's this idiosyncrasy of the politics of higher education. Of course, our campuses are rife with politics, right, in academic life. But there was long held a belief that you could explain all significant variation across the American states and over time by way of simply looking at patterns, differences, in patterns of state economic development. That a kind of economic determinism to explain why states did what they did in the realm of higher education, that has begun to break down over the past couple of decades. There's been a growth in the sheer magnitude of higher education as a societal enterprise. Today we talk about the college loan crisis. We talk about, how many of you take a guess of how much the 50 American states spend on higher education in a given year, last year or in a recent year? You have any sense of the... Now, this is a real test of my instructional prowess because I have at least 3 students in the room today, and I think I mentioned this in class last Thursday. Right, Candy, about $88 billion a year. $88 billion a year the states spend on higher education. This is at a period, in fact, in which we've had dramatic declines in state investment in higher education relative to other things. We'll talk a little bit more about that.
That's all 50 states combined, is it?
Across the 50 states, yeah. It's actually hovering closer to $90 billion this year. So,
that doesn't include any federal spending?
No, okay. Just the states. And in fact, that's $90 billion is probably a pretty good estimate both for, I take back, $90 billion in state appropriations, and there'd be about another $18 to $20 billion in state aid to students, direct aid to students, need-based or non-need-based aid, merit aid, so to speak. The federal government contributes another $45 to $50 billion a year in the form of 2 primary kinds of programs: one, academic science, research on college campuses, and the second one, federal-based financial need programs for students. Yes, sir.
Would that cover both
subsidies for operating budgets and capital expenditures?
Yes, it does. No, I'm sorry, it does not. It does not include the capital expenditures. So that would be another form of indirect. And the last couple of decades, of course, the latest figure I saw was about $1.4 trillion in deferred maintenance on college campuses, public college campuses nationwide, as a result of the tendency of states in these economic recessionary periods. The first thing they put off, of course, is the maintenance of buildings or the building of new ones, unless they're donor supported. So when you add it up, it's probably in the low $100 billion range of state investment in higher education annually. And it's not that's as important politically as simply the headlines of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, often pointing the finger at higher education institutions for having failed to hold down the rate of higher education inflation, the cost to students, the responsibility for loan indebtedness crisis that we have in this country. It has become a much more, as one of my colleagues says nationally, higher education has entered into the high politics of the American states, not the low politics, where it was important but people really didn't consider it an election item. Today, in fact, it's kind of become high politics, higher education has. Governors, as we'll talk a little bit more about, governors are running on higher education platforms for the first time almost ever. We're beginning to see happen in higher education what happened in K-12 education with the rise of those so-called education governors in the American South in the 1980s, from Bill Clinton to others as well, Romer. And then finally, there has been, and this is what I want to talk about here for the next few minutes, a remarkable era of policy change, policy innovation. Some would say policy reform. That's debatable given the implications for higher education throughout the U.S. And in fact, I would argue today that higher education is in a period that is more dynamic, the change is more significant, and the implications more long-lasting for students, for families, for the country than at any comparable time, certainly at any time since the student unrest of the 1960s, since the time of the emergence of our big public systems of higher education supported by huge growth in federal subsidy of students at the GI Bill, 1944, Service and Readjustment Act, and also the rise of the states in the 1950s as major, big subsidizers of higher education. We built our public university systems in the 1950s and 60s after the Second World War for a number of reasons. We've not seen this degree or importance of policy change, certainly since that year, and I would argue probably not in the history of American higher education, dating back perhaps to the Dartmouth decision, Supreme Court decision in 1819. Hit us again, if you would. So, what was that period of the 1950s and 60s, this period of post-war growth in American higher education? Essentially, the period that gave us the foundations and indeed the system of higher education that we have today. Our post-secondary landscape, our public post-secondary landscape, and to some extent our private post-secondary education landscape was shaped primarily in this period of the 1950s and 1960s. And it was highlighted, it was characterized by these things. One, remarkable growth, economic growth in the American states, the American economic miracle after the Second World War. High levels of public subsidy of state universities, which were, of course, made possible because of relatively higher levels of taxation in the states then. A focus on resource inputs. What do we mean by that? The states in the 1950s and 60s, their primary concern was in promoting access to higher education, as was the federal government. Remember, the GI Bill was essentially a subsidy. We will give anybody who wants to go to college, probably even some who might not do well in college. We're going to give them as much money as we possibly can because we want to stimulate economic growth, but more importantly, remember, the purpose of the GI Bill was to prevent what happened after World War I, which was millions of men, young men, who knew how to use weapons marching on Washington, coming back from war. We wanted to provide a social safety net, a safety valve, I should say, for 12 million returning American servicemen and some women. And it was to send them on to college. It was, in Burton Clark's phrasing, it was to be a cooling out mechanism. Send these people to college and let them find themselves. Let's take them off. Make sure they're not on our welfare rolls. Make sure they're not out swelling our unemployment lines. And send them to college. And the federal government initiated this growth, this period of enormous growth in higher education participation in the country. The states were doing this as well. And so what they said was essentially, whatever money we're going to give you, we'll just kind of lay it on the stump and walk away. A line item budgeting did emerge during this period, but for the most part, states simply wanted to put money into universities, and so we developed budgeting systems for public higher education that rewarded the number of students who enrolled on campus. The only thing a university had to do to get money was to enroll more students. And we had enrollment-driven budget formulas in all 50 states by 1967. It rewarded resource inputs. Get more students in your door, you get more money. Increasing reliance on public bureaucracy is a mechanism for ensuring oversight. That is to say that in 1940 and 1945, states were relatively, public universities were relatively unregulated by their state governments. By 1975, every state in the country had something called a governing board, a centralized governing board, or a statewide coordinating board, where there would be, and I mean this not pejoratively, but bureaucrats trained, substantive expertise in matters of higher ed finance and governance, academic programs, who would sit in the state capitol, wherever that office was, helping make determinations about what academic programs ought to be offered on the public campuses and how much money those campuses ought to receive. So we saw a real centralizing of state authority over higher education in that period. And finally, what I just said as well. What's happened and why the change? What are we talking about here today? Well, since the 1980s, we've had a counter-movement in American higher education, at least in public policy toward our universities. We've seen declines in state funding effort for higher education. Now, I emphasize effort because the states still spend $90 billion a year, right? It's not insignificant. In fact, it's the lifeblood of our public universities, for most of them, not for all. I heard a side conversation as I walked in, and I'll come back to this point, about the remarkable divestment of states in some public universities in this country. But in general, we've seen declines in state funding effort, meaning relative, I'll come back to it. Second, the advent of newer accountability concepts and regimes. We're no longer appropriating money on the basis of how many students an institution enrolls, resource input accountability. We're now increasingly talking about performance accountability. Say more about that in just a moment. Growing reliance on private equity markets with which to finance higher education. This is probably the most dramatic change we've seen in the past 25 years in higher education policy, and I think probably the clearest indication that something called a privatization movement, or as I'm going to argue in a couple of minutes, a marketization movement may be underway in our industry. We've seen governance changes with the demise of those strong regulatory systems that I just described, built up in the 50s and 60s. Now many of those being disaggregated or deregulated or decentralized in order to release institutions to interact with markets better. We've seen the arrival on the scene of newer approaches to financial management. For example, some public universities today, I don't have the number, but a growing number of public universities, the question is, why don't we differentiate tuition? University of Arizona, for example. They've had enormous growth at the University of Arizona in demand, enormous increase in demand by students for engineering degrees. Engineering costs more to educate a student than it does in some other areas. Health sciences requires greater investment to produce the same output. Why not differentiate tuition? The University of Arizona and the state legislature began to ask about 15 years ago. Why not charge students at the University of Arizona who want engineering degrees, or any degree that's more costly than the average for the campus, why not charge them a premium? Set their tuition 30% higher than the tuition that, Carla, you don't like this. Set their tuition 30% higher than you would for someone, I don't know, in history, for example. That's precisely what the University of Arizona did, and it's a controversial trend across the country. It's a marketizing trend, right? It does suggest to the, if you will, this is nasty language, I know, but it does suggest to the student consumer that you're free to make your choices in the marketplace. You can choose to go to other institutions or ours, and if you come to ours, you can choose what major you're going to study, but understand there may be financial implications for you in the choice you make, in part because it costs us more to educate you in that major, and in part because we know your labor returns. The premium will be higher to you in the long run. So we're seeing tuition deregulation, tuition differentiation, a lot of newer ways of thinking about how we manage financially our institutions. And finally, growing concerns about the politicizing of higher education governance. I won't say any more other than to suggest that there was one such episode here in the great state of Texas just a few years ago, in which our governor had some strong views about a number of issues at the University of Texas Austin and Texas A&M, and a number of supporters of the governor electorally formed a coalition in order to push back against his agenda. One of them telling me at the time, my gosh, We voted for this individual. We love him. We want him to go on. I'd vote for him for president. But he's dead wrong on higher education. And where does he get this policy? 7 breakthrough solutions for higher education. It led to, you remember that, it led to an enormously controversial issue here in which you had essentially Republicans who support the governor willing to stand up in public and say, we're going to give you a public loss if you don't back away from your new agenda for the University of Texas Austin, which included allegedly sacking Bill Powers, the president of UT Austin. That is one indication. There are many others around the country, in Virginia and many other states, where governors are simply growing much more important and influential in the lives of universities, and some call this politicizing. Yes, sir?
To your list, I would add one that
Please.
may perhaps come partly under your last category, but I think is independent, and that is the increasing use of reliance on technology as a solution to keeping costs down, and the MOOCs movement and Governor Perry's $10,000 4-year
Sure.
education, which relies heavily on technology. I think that's another factor that's separate from those.
You're absolutely right. I agree. I gave a talk yesterday at the faculty club talking on a different topic, and that was, Louisa, what was my talk yesterday?
Evolution, revolution are more than the same.
Yeah, state financing of higher education in the United States. I focused mainly on state financing trends. And we talked a little bit then about the growth of technologies, both as a potential solution, but also as presenting their own problems in this as well. You're absolutely right. Is a policy privatizing movement underway in higher education? Some of us ask ourselves this, and Ron Ehrenberg, a colleague and friend and director of the Higher Education Research Institute, labor economist at Cornell, probably was one of the earliest ones who began talking about a privatization movement in American higher education. What does this mean? What does policy privatization mean? Well, it's unclear in the context of higher education. Are we really talking about public-private ownership distinctions? I mean, are we talking about in this country, and by the way, there's not a single instance of this happening, of having a public university spun off, in fact, to become an independent nonprofit organization? Not a single one has happened. So if that's one's definition of privatization, that isn't happening. How about monopoly versus competition distinctions? Are we suggesting that we're moving from monopolistic control to increased competition and more providers in higher education around the country? That is happening, because the knowledge industry, if you will, is expanding. And because of the advent of technology, where simply new providers can provide, whether it's for-profit institutions, online universities, Western Governors Association, one can attend college from one's home. Our system wasn't built up to support that in the 1950s and 60s. How about the provision of publicly funded services and activities by non-governmental entities, the kind of the third way that Britain experienced? We're not seeing a lot of this. Is there, in fact, something else? Because I don't see privatization really being what's going on in public higher education. I see something a little different, and it's what I've been calling, this next slide, is marketizing trends, or the marketization in state policy for higher education. Really, we're talking not about privatizing function or form. We're talking about making public institutions more highly interactive, dependent on and reliant on markets, all kinds of different markets. For example, we have seen the growing dependence upon private sources of revenue. I mentioned the use of private equity markets, and I'll give you a couple of examples in just a moment. We see the growth of user fees. We see the notion of public higher education no longer being viewed quite so much as a public good, but now as a private good. In fact, I was at a conference just a few weeks ago and talking with a number of vice presidents for government relations at public universities around the country, and I put to each of them the same question. It was, what is the most compelling rationale that you use and use effectively with your state legislators or your governor about the compelling public purpose of public higher education? And they say none. There's not an argument that today works in terms of the public purpose of higher education. So what do you use? They say, we say the same thing any private institution would. Returns on your investment. Labor market returns for the individual. You'll see great football over 4 years. I mean, there are lots of things we can use, but they're for the individual consumer. They're not somehow. What's that? We will. In some public institutions, this happens. So we're seeing this movement to shift the entire language around higher education, its payoffs, primarily in terms of benefits for the individual, not for society. Number two. Yes.
I'm sorry. Is there a perception that it's simply not persuasive, compelling,
Correct.
effective to talk about state prestige? That is, having great universities enhances the image, prestige
Yeah, that's a great question.
of the state. They don't
Yeah.
think that sells.
No,
for
that still
television?
does sell, but the problem, and that sold for a long time, Matthew, it still sells here in Texas.
Yeah.
Because you noticed our governor-elect's agenda just the other day, it wasn't one of his top fives, but just off the agenda was the building of new research universities in the state,
Right.
or the building of existing universities
So
to
that's a
become.
public good.
So he sees that as a state prestige issue,
Right.
and he sees it as a public good. The confounding problem, though, with that argument, which works so well forever, is that research prestige is enormously costly,
Yes.
right?
And there's a long lag time before
It's
you're-
decades,
yeah.
right? We talked about that over a beer. Matthew, what have we not talked about over
We drink so much beer.
Why don't we have beer here?
That is an effective argument, but the problem is that, and I'll talk a bit more about this, the problem is that the whole discourse around American higher education in the States has shifted in even 5 to 10 years. It used to be that we had a system of competition based upon emulation of peer institutions organized around prestige, the unrelenting pursuit of prestige, and the U.S. News and World Report helped provoke that era. The problem now is that the conversation has changed, and no longer is it unfettered institutional competition to be more prestigious, which means research, than your counterpart institution. Increasingly, legislators now are asking, not how can we fund you to become research prestigious, but how can we fund you to get the students who have enrolled out in 4 years? How can we fund you, and what are you doing to increase college participation among historically disadvantaged groups in higher education? How can we solve the problem of college indebtedness by keeping lower than has been the annual rate of inflation tuition rises at your institutions? The conversation has shifted from the notion of research prestige competition in many states, most states, to that of how can we do better for the individual student? Not institutions competing for prestige, but how can we do better for the individual student who's finding that she can't get out in time, that it costs too much, and that it's unclear really what she has after 4, 5, 6, or 7 years of having not been in the labor force fully.
Do you think the prestige argument still applies to the private schools, though?
Yes, I think that too has taken a little bit of a hit. I would argue there's a whole movement underway today around the rise of what I call value consumers in higher education. That the Great Recession since 2008 to 11 and 12, it was so dramatic. It's the only real recession we've ever felt in higher education since the end of the Civil War, when 2/3 of all colleges and universities in this country went out of business within the 4.5 years of that conflict. Since that time, we've never had a real recession in higher education, and we had it just a few years ago. And I think that what that's done, we're beginning to see some empirical literature indicating that consumers no longer will pay anything institutions charge. They're beginning to shift their choices, their behavior about what institutions. They're looking for value. They're not just looking for the most prestigious institution they can afford. So I think it's less so the case in private, but I think it's affected all of our institutions. We're seeing increasing reliance on market mechanisms to promote competition. We're seeing a diminishing direct state control over the governance and management of public institutions. This is what I would say more accurately is underway as a kind of a marketization movement or a marketizing effort in higher education. Thomas, say this again. So, a couple of exhibits for us to consider. One, an era of policy marketization in higher education, Exhibit A. How about declining state funding effort? Let's talk a little bit about funding effort over time. Now remember that the states still spend about $90 billion or so in direct appropriations on higher education. So it's not as though I'm suggesting states have got out of getting themselves out of the game. But if we look over time, this is state fiscal support for the operating expenses of our public universities per $1,000 of personal income. So this is really effort. This is the willingness of states, the effort by states to invest in higher education relative to the available wealth. We control wealth in these numbers. Inflation adjusted. We see this enormous period of growth in the early 1960s, just as I was describing earlier, in which we went from less than $4 per $1,000 of personal income investment in higher ed, rapidly up to almost 3 times that level just a decade later. And then we've seen in the recessionary periods of the early 80s, the the early 90s, the early 2000s, and of course, dramatically so in 2007 and 8. The sharp decline, so that today we're spending, in 2013, we're spending about as much as the states did in 1966 relative to the wealth of the states. States are choosing to spend on other things, or not to spend on other things. This just takes the exact same data as before. This takes the time frame simply more recently from 1989-90 to 2013 and 14. And here in this graphic, we see this declining rate of state funding for higher ed relative to personal income, having declined from $9.74 in 1990 to about $5.45 last year. So these are dramatic declines. States are not investing in higher education relative to the wealth of states. This is let's see how to explain. So this is I love these series of graphics because they show something dramatic going on in the states as well. What I did here was I took the institutional revenue pie, the institution unit of analysis, took the institutional revenue pie, all public four-year institutions in a given state, and I asked what's the percentage of the total revenue pie they receive that comes from state sources, state government appropriations. In 1980, there were only 2 states in the country in which the state's share of total institutional revenue at four-year universities was less than 60%. All the others, we might claim, looked traditionally as they had over time. They were funded primarily, public universities in these states, funded primarily by state sources. They were state-owned institutions and they were state-funded institutions. Only in these 2 states, and what are these?
Hampshire, Vermont, New Hampshire.
Thank you. I'm from South Texas. So only in these 2 states, in fact, did we see states whose institutional revenue profiles began to look a little bit more like, or different than traditionally was the case at state universities. By 1998, we had 14 states that had begun to look more like they're not as publicly funded as they were, and these are by big margins over time. By 2008, we had 25 states. Is there another one in this series? Projected by 2015, and it's been a couple of months since I did this, so this is probably even more now. We'll have probably 35, 36, 37 states that will no longer have the majority of their money coming from state sources. They will be coming from other sources of revenue. We talk in the aggregate a lot when we speak of state finance of higher education. So let me just give you a look at here, a visual of appropriations per full-time equivalent student, FTE, percentage change by state and state appropriations between fiscal year 2008 and 13. This is during the Great Recession. And you see the distribution of the 50 states on this. We have some states like North Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, those states having been ones that have increased appropriations in real dollars during that period of time. Of course, these are states common by what?
Oil.
Right. They're mineral oil extracting states. They have had a lot of wealth they can tax, and they have, I think, wisely put much of that into higher ed.
What's Illinois? Illinois is the highest. So.
Yeah, and it also was hit very hard by the recession. You recall all the stories out of Chicago. Right? It's political leadership in the state. They just decided that they were going to spend more on higher education, even as they were divesting of some other areas. Right. And Illinois is a real outlier. But you see these dramatic declines. I mean, who's over there? With the exception of New Hampshire, right, which had a very low base to begin with because it's a privately supported higher ed system, not a publicly one traditionally. With the exception of that, we have all these southern and western states who've had declines in the region of 35, 40% of state appropriation decline per FTE over just a 5-year period. Now, they were on a low basis to begin with, right, because it's the South and the West that traditionally had funded higher education more so, kept total cost, direct cost to students down. But even they now have caught up more to what used to be a national average. These are dramatic, precipitous declines in state funding effort for higher education.
Yes.
Yes.
Michael, is some of this driven by surging enrollments in those states because those are the most rapidly growing states from a population standpoint? And so, I'm sure not all of it is this, but is some of it just because there are more and more students trying to flood into public universities in those southern and western states?
Yeah, it's a great question, and precisely that is the case. Now, there's another graphic which I think I have toward the end. Let me come back to that at the end if I can. There is, but even when and I'll show it to you, even when we control for FTE, we see, in fact, is that what we've done here? Appropriations per FTE. Yeah, so even when we control for FTE increases in the states, we also find that has diminished over time as well. In some places, dramatically too.
Have you done any comparable graphs comparing state support of K-12 compared with higher ed? Did it go down too, or did it stay up and only higher ed came down?
Yeah, higher ed is the one that's come down so much, and the reason for it is because higher ed is the last and largest discretionary item in state budgets, right? Two reasons. One, there's nothing to protect higher ed from public cuts. Higher ed is, except for some flagship institutions in some states, it's not a strong lobbyist for itself in many cases. Number two, it's viewed as elitist in most places, which doesn't play to down-home politics of state legislatures. And number three, it's the only item in state budgets that can generate its own revenue. Parks can generate a little revenue, but people tend not to go when you jack up the price. Higher ed is the only part of state budgets where the state can cut money, they can pass along tuition increases, and people still keep coming. And legislators can say, well, we didn't do that. We didn't raise the price. Institutions raised the price. Call their president up here. We need to have a talk with him about why, even as they cut funding for higher ed. You know, right. And I have a friend of mine who said to me, who had been very involved in Texas refinance, expert witness for Texas refinance cases in the state, lawsuits, arguing for the inequitable funding of K-12, particularly in poor and minority areas of Texas. And he said to me a number of years ago, Michael, you know, the one thing that higher ed has against one thing it has against you is, Michael, is you don't have any constitutional basis. And in fact, we do not. There is no legal basis to provide. It's a voluntary activity, higher education. So, at a time, and what are states going to cut? They're not going to cut health care spending because they have matching funds from the federal government. They're not going to cut pensions because they're having problems also, and that's very politically unpopular. They're not going to touch prisons. They're not going to touch K-12 because they're protected by state Supreme Court rulings. Higher ed is the only thing that can be cut in many states, and some have argued that higher education now has become the balance wheel, the budgetary balance wheel in every state across the country. When coffers are flush, a little bit more money comes to higher ed. When coffers go down, the first thing and the only thing really that is not protected by a lawsuit or by federal matching dollars or by political preferences is higher education. So that's why it's been tougher on us than any other aspect of state budget. Thank you, sir. Number 2, Exhibit B, an era of policy marketization. How about the case of college savings plans and prepaid tuition programs? Show you a couple of maps real quickly here. In 1990, the college savings plans, recall, are these so-called 529 programs. 529 so named because this is the section under the IRS code which began to recognize, the states were the first ones that did it, began to recognize that individuals who put money aside for the express purpose of paying for a dependent's education might pay for that today, it's taxed today, but might put it in a fund that would grow over time, and when they used it for justifiable educational purposes in 5 years or 10 years or 40 years, it would be not taxed at the moment in which it comes out. So this is another effort to try to rely on private equity markets to grow individual savings to prepare them for college because states were saying, we're not going to be able to do it as we did in the past. In 1990, college savings plans, there were just 2 states that had them. By 1999, there were 28 states that had them. And just go back just a moment, if you would, because what's dramatic here is, think about this, if you go back to the period of the 1950s and 60s, of course, no one was to save for their own college education. The express purpose of the federal and the state government primarily was to build up the federal government to target individuals to have federal benefits to attend college, particularly those in financial need, and for the states to build a highly subsidized system of provision of higher education goods and services so that tuition levels would be very low. 40 years later, what we said in effect is, our prices ain't low. The money for federal and state financial need is not kept up with the higher education inflation index rate. Consumer, student, prospective student, you and your family need to be saving for your education, not government. That's been the sea change that we've seen. I stopped at 99 because this is when the federal government began to build this into its own tax code, and then we kind of had a effect across all 50 states coming from the federal government. That's a distinction I'll come back to in a moment when I talk about how we've studied this. Prepaid tuition programs. Tell us about those. Well, in 1990, there were just 6 states in the country that had prepaid tuition programs. Do you, anybody recall? Have you purchased credits in one such program yourselves for your family, or
Texas Tomorrow Fund.
how does that work?
It's we started. I don't think you can't enroll in it now. This is like back in 1998 when my son was born, and then you pay in a certain amount, and whatever that rate is at that level, that's what we will. If he goes to a Texas university,
Right.
We can't take it out until then, but then we can. That's how it works.
Right. Yes.
I actually had Texas Tomorrow Fund.
Did you?
They promised to pay for public
Yes.
fully, and when you pay like a down payment
Yes.
when it first came out. But then towards private, they paid a certain allotment, so
Yeah.
it came out to be like double what you first put in.
Yeah. That's what it came out for you, to be about double of the initial investment.
Yeah.
So it's a good return. Yeah. Well, these went bankrupt in almost every state in the country because, in fact, it was a good return. The premise of using private equity markets is that the presumption is, now remember this in the 80s, go-go days of the stock market, the notion was that the market inevitably would rise faster than higher education inflation. Higher education inflation has risen many times beyond the stock market in that period. Prepaid tuition programs took a different tack, whereas college savings programs said, simply put money allow a private manager to manage the money. In prepaid tuition programs, you put the money in with the state invested it. But what the state did was to guarantee you certain credits of tuition paid at any university in the state that would be used by you when you claim it for your dependent person.
So public or private? Any university in the state?
Most states did only public. Some states like Texas had private as a percentage of what the public contribution would have returned to you. Florida so skews this because 44% of all the investment in prepaid tuition programs nationally comes out of the state of Florida. They have the largest, now closed. Almost all these programs are closed over time. But the question at this time was, what's leading to these adoption of these innovative-looking, market-looking like policies? Tell us, by 1999 there were 21 states doing this. These prepaid tuition programs. Are you getting tired of me poking you on the shoulder? Show us another policy here. Let's see what came up. Exhibit C. How about the performance accountability movement? So we talked about college savings programs, prepaid tuition programs, the decline in state funding of higher education with commensurate increases in prices. Performance accountability. This is perhaps the most popular initiative in higher education, popular political initiative in higher education today. And it's where so much of the debate in American higher education and public policy attends. The rhetoric of this new accountability movement has called for a refocusing of attention on outcomes of what campuses do, rather than the traditional focus on inputs. And in this new accountability era, turn back to okay. State policymakers have sought to influence institutional behavior for the purpose of improving institutional performance.
We're leaving him.
Tough.
Tough crowd. Hiroki, can you move that? Can you move the water thing? It's kind of in the middle of the presentation. I also really wanted to do that, sorry.
Okay. Can you put us forward one? Mm-hmm. It's a very tough job. Mm-hmm. Performance Funding 1.0 has linked state funding directly and tightly to the performance of public campuses on individual indicators. So what states are now saying is, rather than give you money on the basis of how much enrollment you have, how many students you enrolled the previous year, we're going to create some indices, some indicators of performance. For example, what is your graduation rate? What was it last year? And on the basis of how well you did in graduating students, we'll set aside some amount of money to reward you or penalize you for achieving state purposes, right? Thanks, Louisa. Let's go one more. In 1990, the first state that adopted this was 1979, Tennessee. In 1990, there were only 2 states in the country that had a performance funding initiative. By 1995, there were 8 states. By 2002, there were 25 states. I thought I had another graphic in here. I do not. Today, there are 36 states in the country that have adopted some form of performance funding. Click one more, Louisa, if you would. Let me see if I have in here the notion of... No, I don't. Go back. There has emerged more recently the idea of performance funding 2.0. 1.0 was, we'll put some money on the side, and it will reward institutions who meet state objectives, state policy goals, like graduation rates. Tennessee, not the state you think of as a policy leader in higher education, but they have been very innovative in higher ed the last 30 years. Tennessee did something remarkable 4 years ago. Tennessee adopted something we're now calling Performance Funding 2.0. What they say is, we're not going to set aside a little bit of money on the side and allow that to be divided among all public universities in the state on the basis of how well they meet certain pre-specified objectives. Rather, we're going to build performance into the base funding formula of all universities to begin with. 2 years ago, for the first time in the country, the state of Tennessee was the state that said we will appropriate 100% of the $1.4 billion allocation we give to public universities every year. 100% of that on the basis of how well they performed the previous year on certain indicators that we created for them. So again, the idea that instead of public universities receiving money on the basis of it's just good that they receive money and do good things for society, the notion now is that they need to demonstrate performance or they will receive no public funding. This is now catching on in Ohio and a number of other states as well. Louisa, take us to broad-based state merit scholarship programs. I'm just going to throw this in. Some argue that this is an additional aspect of marketization of public policy, but you recall the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program adopted in the early 1990s, which shifted all of state aid in that state from need-based aid and allocated on the basis of merit. These Hope Scholarship programs were to provide money to encourage students to do well in high school. And if they did well in high school, according to pre-specified criteria, in Georgia at the time it was a 3.5 high school GPA, if you met those criteria, you went tuition-free to any university in the state. It was what allowed the University of Georgia within 15 years to have a 220-point SAT increase, which is historic for any public university in the country. They were they're trying to staunch brain drain, keeping their best and brightest Georgia students in-state instead of escaping to other states across the country. In 1999, there were 9 states. In 2005, there were 14 states, and today there's a 15th state, being Oklahoma. So again, an indication of the enormous amount of policy activity that's underway in the states. Let's go one more time, because I think we have another policy, just to illustrate how much innovation is underway here in policy for higher ed. These are dual enrollment policies. Dual enrollment, you recall, is the mechanism in which states say that if you complete courses in high school, some of those courses can also count toward your 4-year degree in college, an additional effort to try to move people more efficiently through systems. In 1980, there were a handful of states that had done this. By 2005, almost every state in the country had. But what I want to point out here, and it's the basis for the next couple of minutes, what I want to point out is, and what we've been studying is, a question in why states do what they do at the times they do it, right? None of the states have moved all at the same time toward any policy. There's not a single graphic on here that shows all 50 states having endorsed any one of them. And we see this interesting variation, this natural experiment that is the 50 American states, with lots of interesting variation over time, states choosing to make certain decisions about what policies they'll move toward and what policies they won't. And the question that I've had for about 15 years or more has been, what in fact are the forces and the factors that are promoting states or influencing states to make the decisions they do, the policy decisions they do at the times they do? So we have a newer kind of research question today we've been focusing around. What extent do the socioeconomic, demographic, political, and governance contexts of the states shape public choice for higher education? 2, how does variation in state political institutions, actors, and processes impact the policy choices of states? 3rd, to what extent do the advocacy behaviors of campuses and systems influence policy outcomes? 3 is essentially an interest group question. Number 4, how do the preferences of elected officials influence state policy? And 5, to what extent do states learn? To what extent do they mimic or borrow or steal ideas from their neighbors? Many of you here recognize this as kind of the classic formulation of the policy diffusion hypothesis. To what extent do policies diffuse because states emulate one another's behavior? Those have been a series of questions on which I've been at work, and a number of others in the field over time. Essentially, I'm sorry you can't see this well, almost the entire field has been studying essentially policy effects. Right? Most of my colleagues study, so we have a policy, who cares how it got there? The most important question is, what effect does it have? And I do some of that work as well. But the question I've really been interested in is the next one, which is, how do we, you can't even say that at all. No. Here's policy effects.
We can turn off the lights.
Here's the policy itself. I want to back up into the process and understand what factors influence states to do the things they do at the times in which they do them. It's kind of a classic political science question, right? Why do governments do what they do when they do it? This has been my research program for some period of time. a major element of it, is essentially on the political economy of state post-secondary policy change. My work is focused a lot around economic, demographic, political, structural indicators as sources of policy change at the state level. Mine has been a focus on sources of state-level changes emerging over time. 10
minutes.
Focus on sources of state-level changes emerging over time. So I've approached this not cross-sectionally but longitudinally as well. And number 3, a focus on constructing, because when I began doing this, there were no data sets. I mean, there were elements of data sets that I could put together, but a focus on constructing integrated longitudinal data sets, allowing us to examine multiple kinds of theoretical propositions about why governments do what they do.
Go.
Yeah, please, sorry. Our core model, very simplified core model, has been that the notion that state-level reform in higher education and policy innovation is a byproduct of 4 broad sets of factors. 1, the state's socioeconomic context. 2nd, the state's governance structure for higher education. 3rd, and this is where our work has produced or has focused on things that the work before almost never did. There really wasn't any sustained interest, as I mentioned at the outset of our talk, around the ways in which political institutions shape policy outcomes. And there wasn't much, in fact, any focus on ways in which states emulate one another's policy behavior or policy diffusion. So that's been a major focus of our work. Some of the key political institutions, actors, conditions we've analyzed is partisanship. How do things such as party control or strength in state legislatures or the governor's office influence policy outcomes? Gubernatorial control, the strength of governors constitutionally, as well as other aspects of gubernatorial control. Legislative design, for example, do some of the structural characteristics of legislatures, whether that's in the kinds of rules they have created to govern themselves, or whether it's in the form of degree of professionalism, of the professionalization of legislatures with staff and characteristics that make them, state legislatures, look like the U.S. Congress. Does that influence policy outcomes in higher ed? Bureaucratic control, meaning the ways in which higher education has created mechanisms at the state level to govern themselves, coordinating boards, governing boards. There's variation in those between high degrees of centralization and low degrees. Essentially, does it matter that Texas has a higher education coordinating board in Austin, which has weak powers? Does it matter that Georgia has a very strongly empowered State Board of Regents of the university system, which controls all decisions for all public universities in Georgia? Does that variation in bureaucratic control of higher education matter? Election timing, political ideology and culture, and descriptive attributes of legislators themselves. Luis has been working with me on one such project. I've been talking with others in the room as well about this. Essentially, that old continuing debate in political science literature and elsewhere around to what extent do the descriptive characteristics of elected officials influence their substantive policy behavior. Now, may not have been that important in higher education 20 or 30 years ago, but today it's pretty important because we're seeing changes in state legislatures in terms of their ethnic and racial composition. Doesn't matter that we're seeing a surge in Hispanic legislators, for example. Does that matter with respect to higher education policy? Are they likely legislatures with more or less women, or more or less Catholics, or more or less professionals, or more or less fewer Hispanic legislators, likely to behave and create policies that are different than in differently structured represented institutions? Louisa? In order to do this work, we had to create so imaginatively, I call the State Postsecondary Policy Database. Here's some of the people I've been working with over time in this. Today, it's grown to be about 400 variable indicators across 50 states. Over about 35 years, we don't have complete data for all 35 years for all of those variables and indicators. But today, the data set contains about 1,750 state year observations and about 800,000 cells of data. So we've been able to do some things quantitatively that people in the field of higher education had not been able to do before. Methodologically, our approaches have been primarily 2. First, for the study of dichotomous outcomes, meaning, for example, what influenced the timing of a given state's adoption of a particular policy in a given year? a dichotomous outcome. Did the state adopt a policy or did it not? Did it choose to adopt a college savings program in 1994 or did it not? And what factors may have influenced it to do so? So we're looking across all 50 states, we're looking over time, and we're looking at a series of hypothesized influences on state governmental behavior. For these kinds of questions, like why did that state adopt a college savings program this year, or an in-state tuition provision benefiting non-citizen students, or a prepaid tuition program, or a performance accountability program. For that, we've been using event history analysis and more recently the Cox proportional hazard models. In the study of appropriations or of other spending decisions by government, we've used generally GMM regression, which has a number of positive benefits. So mainly event history analysis for dichotomous outcomes, or for other kinds of things such as spending fixed effects, various kinds of fixed effects models. These are just kind of some of the, pulled out a couple of sample publications to give you a sense of the titles and the kinds of things we've been looking at. State spending on student financial aid and campus appropriations, in-state resident tuition policies, prepaid tuition college savings programs. This one, privileging public research universities, looks at the forces that may have been influencing state spending, higher levels of state spending on research universities rather than other kinds of institutions like comprehensive institutions once you back out the higher costs associated with research itself. State appropriations again, the enactment of certain kinds of governance reforms in higher ed, and one of the first studies that we did in this stream of work is what shaped state policy choice in the area of performance accountability. Why did states adopt these new kinds of performance funding programs? So let me just, in conclusion, share with you some select factors. And I apologize in advance. We've covered a lot of terrain, both substantively and otherwise, and there's a lot of detail here. So what I did here was try to just to kind of pastiche, kind of select out a number of major findings from across the various studies. One, and this is not insignificant for our field. I mean, it just seems so obvious to you, but politics matters more than is conventionally believed. In fact, one of the strongest findings of all of our panel data analyses or event history analyses over time, looking at 50 states over time, is how not the economic determinants of state policy behavior, but it's the political determinants of state policy behavior. For example, we see, and for the first time in this literature, and now others are picking up these effects as well, some fairly strong and as hypothesized relationships between partisanship in the states and higher education policy outcomes. For example, we're seeing some consistency in findings across different data sets using different methods. We're seeing some consistency in findings that shows that, for example, Republicans have been more likely, Republican control of legislatures, more likely to create or to adopt the most rigid, tough forms of performance funding for higher education. The toughest accountability provisions in the country for higher education have come out of Republican legislatures. We also find, though, curiously, for the first time in a couple of studies, we've been able to replicate this, Republican support. So Democrats are associated with higher spending on appropriations for campuses. Republicans are associated with higher spending on students. And it may go to this broader theme that we think about in terms of some kind of classic cleavages between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans perhaps more willing to fund individuals, a kind of an empowerment culture. Democrats more willing to fund institutions. But these are a whole range of kind of party-related effects that we're beginning to see that we didn't see in the literature before. One, we're seeing effects related to the institutional powers of governors, often in the direction of governors with more power in states where there's less is spent on higher education, and also governors with greater power in states seen where there's lower tuition pricing for students. Timing matters too. We've also found in a number of studies the importance of simply election cycles. Here, this is not too different from the kinds of findings that the Berrys found in their seminal studies in the early 1990s, Francis Stokes Berry and Bill Berry. in the policy innovation literature, in which they found that the years in which state legislatures were most likely to adopt newer forms of taxes was the year after a statewide election. There are other kinds of things that benefit consumers or voters that states are more likely to adopt in the year of election or near the year of election. And we see some of these effects in higher education as well. Broadly popular initiatives in higher education, like ones that distribute new kinds of benefits to citizens, we find state legislatures adopting close to election time, statewide elections. Other kinds of things that might penalize people in higher education, we see them adopting in odd, off-year times. We see the importance of legislative professionalism coming up almost in every study that we do. The importance of having more staff, more dedicated time to debate legislative measures. States where there's greater professionalism, we often find associated statistically with certain kinds of policy outcomes for higher education. We do find evidence for this descriptive substantive representation hypothesis. For example, states that are most likely to, in states that have higher representation of Hispanic legislators, all things equal, we tend to find they're more likely in a given year to adopt certain in-state resident tuition policies, providing in-state tuition levels for mainly Hispanic citizens. The manner in which states choose to govern their systems of higher education also has important implications for states. We found, for example, that in the most aggregated form, called a consolidated governing board for higher education, kind of the Georgia model, where you have one body at the state level that represents all public universities in the state. They're also viewed anecdotally as having a pretty better advocacy voice than in states like Texas, where the coordinating board is very weak and you have institutions all trying to get what they can legislatively year after year. Very decentralized advocacy environment. That in these more centralized states, we find those states less likely to adopt very rigorous forms of accountability and performance funding. Perhaps because of the ability of these centralized governance structures for higher ed actually to be able to mobilize resistance to legislative action to hold higher education more accountable. We find almost no support for conventional ways of thinking about diffusion. And almost all our diffusion models, it's changed some in the last decade, but almost all our diffusion models have been regional diffusion models. If ideas spread in higher education policy communities across the United States, if they spread across states, they're most likely to be spreading among policy communities, not regionally any longer. We simply don't change policy primarily because a state next door to us changed theirs. It's probably because ideas and information are flowing through different influence channels than used to be the case. So we find almost no diffusion effects in the way in which we conventionally study them. And there's also, I would simply suggest here at the end, the need for more fine-grained analysis of policy change over time. All of our research has focused on the kind of correlates of policy creation. I'm trying to sound alliterative. The correlates of policy creation. Almost none of the work has looked to date on the determinants of policy decline or death. In other words, we have these life cycles of public policies, just like with performance accountability that was very popular in the 80s and 90s, kind of went out of fashion and then has reemerged as performance funding 2.0. What accounts for the decline in policies or for policy termination, as well as for state adoption of the policy to begin with? We have virtually none of that work in the field as well. So I hope this has given you a little bit better sense of, one, the breadth of policy change, two, the magnitude of the importance of some of the changes that states have undertaken in public policy for higher ed, and third, maybe a little sense of the kind of work that some of us in the field are now trying to do, notwithstanding the importance of understanding the effects of public policies, but also now trying to focus systematically and from a discipline-based perspective or perspectives around what forces influence states to be innovative or to reform their policies in the first place. I'm happy to take questions or comments or revolution of some kind. Yes, sir.
I have so many questions, we ought to have a beer sometime.
Let's do that.
I'll start with one quick comment and then one question. The comment is that I think your model may help explain why 3 academic publishers sued Georgia for copyright infringement. I'll let that go for the time being. But the question is, have you looked at the Texas Academy of Math and Science as a case study in Texas? Because I've learned a lot about it because I interview applicants from there for Princeton every year. Those of you who don't know it, this is a program funded by the state legislature in Texas that takes juniors and seniors from high schools all over Texas who apply to this program, sends them to UNT for their last 2 years in high school where they're actually enrolled in college courses.
Right.
If they decide to stay at UNT, they finish up in 2 years. As it turns out, very few decide to stay at UNT, and most of them apply to elite universities all over the country. So my question is, what does the state legislature think it is getting out of this program, since unlike Georgia, it doesn't keep the students in state, it tends to disperse them?
To divine the intelligence of our legislative bodies would be far above my pay grade. I don't know. What we know from many of these programs nationally, there is evidence that, in fact, is strong evidence, that, in fact, Georgia achieved its policy objective. They had many more students after 1983 and 4 and 5, 93 and 4, with the advent of their Hope Scholarship program. They had many more students who otherwise might have left the state who stayed. But in some states, that evidence is not very strong. We have programs. In fact, here are a couple of things we know about Hope Scholarship programs, about so-called merit programs in the 15 states that have them. Number one, 95% of the benefits that go, the benefits that go to individuals who are given a merit scholarship, in 95% of those cases, they would have attended college anyway. That's okay. In 88% of the cases of individuals who receive these, they come from middle or upper income families. Now that's fine as well. If the purpose of a state really is to retain its best and brightest, then one could argue that the socioeconomic profile of the student is immaterial. But in the era of state divestment and other kinds of public subsidy that helps keep the cost of attending higher education low, what Georgia has done, which is now to allocate 4 out of every $5 of its financial aid dollars on the basis of merit, when none of those merit dollars really advantage students who most need the dollars to attend college. That's another public policy question. So in many cases, these policies, I'm answering this question roundabout, in some of these cases, there's not strong evidence that what they intended to achieve under these kinds of programs, in this case a dual enrollment program, actually are succeeding. They were adopted. They remain funded. There's not strong evidence that they're having their intended policy effect. In some cases, like in the case of merit scholarship programs, they're actually having perhaps their intended effect, but they're also having ancillary effects, unintended consequences that may be worse than what was initially designed in the program itself. Yes?
I'm curious about, you've looked at all the different ways that legislators are influenced in structures like this. Since they have become, in a sense, or they've made themselves now the market for higher education by determining what they will fund, how much are they what influences legislators, business communities, what they're hearing from constituencies? I'm wondering what's underneath their decisions about higher education as politicians looking over their shoulder at someone else's interests.
Yeah, it's a great question. Matthew, I'm sure, has the answers for this one as a political scientist. Matthew, you have any thoughts?
Well, one question I was going to ask you is whether you've backed up one step previously and looked at determinants of public opinion about higher education funding. I would suspect, but I'm guessing here, I haven't actually looked at a lot of data, that it's some of the same perceptions that you say fuel state legislative perceptions here. For example, perceptions of elitism. That is, those who are more downscale, I suspect, are going to be more suspicious of higher education relative to other priorities than others. I know anecdotally that a lot of legislators from low-income communities are much more eager to get on board with direct funding to students than they are with sending a lot of money to institutions. Because if the money goes to institutions, these legislators from low-income communities tend to say, well, that's great, we're funding higher education, but not a lot of my people get to go to those places.
That's right.
Whereas if you make scholarship funds available, something that students can take. So, it's your talk, not mine.
No, I agree with you, and I think the politics of this increasingly, I think, cuts in different ways.
Right.
One thing that is so clearly different. In fact, I wonder to what extent our work is more emblematic of an age that has ended. We studied this. I think so. One can make the argument that in fact the business model, higher education business model, has now changed. It's unsustainable. That's unlikely to. We have a new normal, and the new normal was set under the terms of the economic duress that states faced between 2008 and 11 or 12. That we have moved so decisively away and clearly away from the old ways, or 5 years ago, the conventional ways of governing, funding, overseeing, monitoring, even talking about higher education, public higher education in particular, that there may be a whole new set of factors that will influence future state decisions that influenced them even just a few years ago. And we see all of these kind of mixed motives at work as well, right? I mean, 5 years ago, we would have, the conventional notion, and we found in some of our work, was that, in fact, we find this as one of the consistent best predictors of state funding for higher education across the 50 states over time has to do with the percentage of percentage of minority legislators, percentage of Hispanic legislators, percentage of women, percentage of black legislators, and also the demographic characteristics of the states. States with more diverse, with larger minority populations, tend to support higher levels of public investment in higher education. But Matthew, I think you just made a good case that what we may be seeing now is something different, that the politics of public higher education now maybe shifting in some ways. I don't know the answer to your question. I suspect that public opinion and what we generally find in public opinion is probably an important piece of that. We know a lot anecdotally, but not a lot social scientifically about that. Yes, Carla, and then Diego?
So I am ignorant about the issue, but I'm a parent. So the other day I was watching CNN and the Ivory Tower, and I was very upset as a Hispanic, very conservative parent, thinking about, I don't really care about the college experience. I didn't have it, and I turned out right. So why will I be interested in having my son attend institutions where there are so many distractions for academic pursuits? I was very upset. And then they are paying for that.
Can you give us some examples so we all know what you're referring to?
In this program, they were showing that state institutions like the one I'm coming from, the University of Colorado, that it seems the party institution, the number one party institution in the nation, that it's not that I'm very happy about that. What they are trying to do is that they are trying to bring students from that are going to pay out-of-state tuition, and for that they are offering them attractive things, like a lot of parties, a lot of free time, and
lazy river.
Yeah, so
country club right. Yeah.
So yes, and they I got my own tuition as a student go up because they build this recreation center that we actually didn't need. Like, we are in the Rockies, you know, go out. And so I was wondering, why should I pay for this? I am actually coming here to study. I don't care about your rock climbing wall and all that, you know. So is it that now parents are going to like act out and start pushing legislators to stop this, because now you're thinking this is the future of my son.
Let me respond in a concrete way and an abstract way. First, the abstract one. This takes us back precisely where we began in that initial conversation. There is, I believe, there is evidence of a value movement underway in higher education. The old model was one of institutional competition for prestige, right? The way that you achieve prestige, and I'm putting too simple a gloss on this, but the way in the old model that you achieve prestige was you had ever-increasing faculty productivity, research productivity. You had more and more of your institutional dollars spent on research infrastructure, and you had better and better undergraduate students, measured conventionally, mainly by SAT, but also ACT scores. Thus, the marketplace rewarded campuses for spending on things that would attract the very highest student you could find Now, Colorado is a little different because you also have a lot of students there in that state who are coming not because, one of Colorado's financing strategies for higher education, because it was nearly bankrupt in higher education, they had to really cut back state funding for higher education. So what Colorado did was to say, particularly at the University of Colorado, was to say, mainly we're going to make budget because we're going to enroll ever-increasing numbers of out-of-state students.
Oh, yeah.
What those out-of-state students want is an experience.
Yeah.
So you get the rock climbing wall indoors as opposed to the Rockies outdoors, right? At Vanderbilt, when I was there, we had some of you may know this. We had a $250 million. Our residential commons system, the Commons at Vanderbilt, was $250 million on the books. There's another 30 to 40 million because of cost overrides and other things off the books. We spent $300 million at Vanderbilt to construct a residential learning system consisting of 10 undergraduate houses whose main themes are different identities related to Hogwarts. That is not the kind of experience that you want for your child. But at Vanderbilt, where the model was of very high tuition levels, right? Very high prices. So you've got to return something to the consumer. And part of it is to have a really good experience as an undergraduate. But second, to be able to attract to Nashville, Tennessee, the best possible students you can get from New York City, from Manhattan, from the West Coast, from Chicago, from China. The way you do that is you provide not only what you're going to argue all along, even if we know it's a damn lie, which is we're the finest academic institution in the world, but then also you're going to wrap around that a series of things that make one's life seem wonderful. And that is, I think, what we're beginning to see price resistance. We're beginning to see parents increasingly say, that's great for the relatively small percentage of Americans who attend places like Vanderbilt or Colorado or SMU. But if you look at the 7- and 8-year graduation non-completion rate for our public institutions, if you look at some institutions that have a 5-year graduation rate of 14%, 86% of students attending some of our institutions, public institutions, do not graduate in 5 years. The argument now in the midst of the new normal that was the Great Recession now has changed all of this. And the things that just a few years ago we thought seemed very normal and that we should reward now seem superfluous and silly and perhaps belonging to another age. So I do think that the politics underlying what may influence states to change policy, adopt new policy, or innovate and reform may be different in this era in which we've come into, because a couple of things here will endure. The states will never come back on as the primary financial stakeholders in public higher education. It is now, I don't have the graphic here, but tuition as net percent of total institutional revenues at public four-year universities last year was 46.5%. If you take all public four-year institutions in the country and ask where their money came from, their total budget pie, 46.5% on average came from non-state sources. By next year or the year after, that'll be over 50%. University of Texas at Austin, last year 11% of their revenue comes from the state of Texas. Texas A&M, it's around 18%. University of Michigan, it's 7.5%. University of Virginia, it's about the same. What portion, in what ways are these public universities any longer public if 93% of their revenue comes from non-state sources? So that's the magnitude of the change that we're seeing underway.
So actually we have time for one last question, and you are next on cue.
So I love the talk, Michael, and I would love to join the beer club. Talk about this issue. So one of my questions was if you have noticed an increase in the weight of the importance of the flagship universities in each state.
Yes.
Like if the limited resources that the states are giving to public universities are allocated mostly to the flagship universities rather than, like in California, the Cal State colleges, for instance, versus to UCLA or Berkeley, right? Like we are noticing that change as well, that now that this funding is going towards the more flagship universities. And second, if that is happening, if that will be kind of this perception of elitism, there is Francisco Ramirez, who argues that the meaning of attending college now is changing, right? Like attending college is also which college are you attending,
right.
And that also varies by if you're attending the flagship university, then you're attending you're getting your value back from where. So I don't know if you are seeing those trends also as well in the
Yes.
data that you're presenting.
Very brief responses to the two questions. Number one, in fact, we're seeing the opposite trend with respect to state funding priorities over time. There's, in fact, a kind of a modest movement is too strong, but an argument being made nationwide that what states ought to do is they probably ought to get out of the business of funding flagship universities at all. They are going to be your most expensive, research-intensive universities that increasingly, by nature of what they do, they just can't fund it on the basis of state appropriations. So what states ought to be doing is pouring the money into institutions that educate the least likely to attend, the least likely to succeed, create the financial infrastructure needed to actually get these students who are on the margin through college as opposed to losing them in dropout and stop out. So I would argue, as I did yesterday at the other talk, that we're seeing in this country the emergence of a three-tiered system of higher education. Traditionally, historically, we always said it was two-tiered after the Dartmouth decision. After 1819, we had a private college system called Dartmouth and others. We had a public university system as states rushed to create universities under their own statutory arm. Today, I'd argue we have a three-tier system. We have the traditional private college system. We have the traditional public college system. But now we have the emergence of UT Austin and University of Michigan and Colorado and Virginia and go down the list of about 100 public universities in this country that are publicly owned but no longer publicly financed. And I would call them an emerging breed of hybrid public-private universities. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question is what?
If
yes, the returns. Thank you.
Yeah.
The returns on completion of college. We know this interesting.
Which college?
Yeah.
The type of college the students are attending.
Yes.
Like, for example, minority students, for example, in California,
Yes.
will go to the Cal State system
Yes.
rather than the UCLA or
Yes.
Berkeley that are becoming less diverse over time.
Yes.
So, if that would contribute to this sense of elitism and who these universities
Yes.
or the high or research universities are serving, what
Yes.
constituencies?
If one were to take two sets of data, or two sets of information, one is the leading flagship institutions in the country, and then also, and you were to rank them, but you were to rank them according to the percentage of students on campus that receive Pell Grants. Remember, Pell Grants are the federal grant that provides access or provides financial opportunity for students of low means, right? You would find that the public flagship universities, the best ones in the country, are at the lowest end of that list. Increasingly, there has been more and more of our public flagship elite campuses are becoming more and more white. And there's a movement underway to begin to reward these campuses, perhaps under changes in Pell Grant eligibility, perhaps according to other things the federal government might do, that would actually encourage institutions to take into their entering classes more Pell Grant recipients. So we don't end up with a have and a have-not system of higher education in the country. It already exists. It exists in economic terms. We don't want it to exist as well, even deeper than it has historically along racial and ethnic terms. I will say this, a really interesting piece of econometric evidence that we have is that the labor market returns of those who graduate from a public flagship institution there's a substantial premium over those who attend college from comprehensive institutions. Why that might be the case, whether it's simply a signaling mechanism to the market, to employers, whether it's other kinds of substantive cognitive gains that emerge, we don't know that. But it does matter where one goes, to an elite public or to a more open access public. And if that's the case, then the question about who gets in these places to begin with is also very important because it has tangible material outcomes for our population and populations.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.